The image of the beggar entails a reversal of our attitude and consciousness. We may believe that we give him something, that we may contribute to his welfare, but the essence of his being is that he holds something for us to receive. He may hold in his hand and whisper through his mouth a wisdom free of conventional ethics, transcending our conscious distinction of good and evil. Beyond the blushing face of shame, the beggar's hand is full of emptiness. He holds nothing in his hand. We may so easily pass by without noticing him. Only by stopping for a moment may we see what he can give, an opportunity to feel and hear, to reflect and forget myself, that is, my ego, and to know what not to forego. These are the words of Errol Shallot in The Beggar Archetype. Like so many women my age, I'm a survivor of breast cancer, not once, but twice. The first occurrence changed my life profoundly, but not with the momentous resolve that the second occurrence set in motion. With 2 decades and a host of transformative experiences in between the two events, revisiting the illness at age 67 was barely comparable to the first diagnosis at 47. Firmly planted in the second half of life, my mortality even more vivid in my consciousness than in my 40s. I was shaken to my core by the urgency of life's calling and the work I had firmly embraced some 12 years prior. Staggered by the lifestyle changes I knew I needed to make in order to minimize the possibility of a third occurrence, I made them. Diet, exercise, and an attitude of gratitude were my new best friends. Yet the second confrontation with a life-threatening illness had even more to teach me than attending to my physical well-being. While I had been attending to my spiritual path for decades, something greater than my rational mind and ego arranged a deeper descent on that path that I could neither have imagined nor orchestrated. Several years before my first occurrence of breast cancer, I encountered the work of Carl Jung and was profoundly shaken and shaped by the notion of the human shadow. Nearly all indigenous traditions have some notion of the shadow, but until Jung, it was never clearly articulated in Western civilization, let alone addressed as an aspect of humanity that required healing. According to Jung, any part of ourselves that we send away or disown because it does not fit with our ego image of ourselves, or that our culture and families of origin say does not fit, does not simply vanish, but takes up residence in the unconscious mind. From that place of clandestine disregard, it develops a life of its own and must either be projected onto other humans or it causes us to act out the very aspects of the psyche that we have endeavored to repress. Throughout my years of regular and intense personal therapy, I was humbled and horrified to acknowledge the contents of my shadow. Yet the most welcome but daunting challenge was the discovery that each time I owned my shadow and worked intentionally with healing it, I felt lighter, more loving, more compassionate, and astonishingly more whole. I believe that the journey of psychospiritual healing is never finished in this lifetime. That is to say that more of our shadow is waiting to be revealed, not for the purpose of punishing us, but because the endless waste bin in which we have deposited the shadow holds, as Jung declared, pure gold. In fact, the shadow's compost holds the exact fertilizer necessary for the transformation of consciousness. 1 year after my second occurrence of breast cancer, I discovered the work of spiritual teacher Leslie Temple Thurston and her partner Brad Laughlin, whose perspective on shadow healing was unfamiliar to me, yet felt inexplicably synergistic and compatible with my spiritual journey. A cornerstone of Leslie's teaching, I discovered, is the deceivingly simple concept of generosity. I had always considered myself a generous person, yet, as with so many aspects of the spiritual path, all authentic learning compels us to not merely learn, but to be willing to descend into ever deeper layers of what we think we are learning. While I regularly contributed to many worthy causes in my adult life, I consciously overlooked and unconsciously recoiled against giving money on the street to homeless people. I just knew that they would immediately run to the nearest liquor store or marijuana dispensary or other homeless people to purchase mind-altering substances with my hard-earned money. To my surprise, in working with the shadow of my generosity, the inner Scrooge, I discovered that what really mattered was not what the homeless person did with my money, but what giving it to them did for me. That is not to say that I suddenly felt righteous by giving money, or that by giving I could walk away from the homeless person and ignore their suffering or the economic injustice of the culture that put them on the street. Rather, more momentous than the willingness to put some dollar bills in the hand of a homeless man or woman was the simple but life-changing experience of opening my heart to them. Journey to the Promised Land is a book about a chain of events set in motion by my willingness to do that. The second occurrence of breast cancer for me happened in Boulder, Colorado, one of the most affluent cities in America. I am one of a minority of people in Boulder who lives in affordable housing, without which I would not be able to live there at all. My work, and I believe divine design, took me to Boulder, where I was delighted to live in a progressive city surrounded by dog-friendly, bicycle-friendly, outdoor-obsessed, health-conscious citizens, and where a variety of spiritual traditions flourish. Yet Boulder is not immune to homelessness, and in fact, in a milieu that touts compassion, generosity, and helping the less fortunate, Boulder is yet another in a very long line of cities that has barely begun to deal with the shadow of its collective inner Scrooge. Only 1 year after my second cancer diagnosis, I was catapulted into an encounter with my own and this culture's inner Scrooge. Ebenezer Scrooge, of course, is a character in Charles Dickens' mid-19th century story, The Christmas Carol, depicting an extremely miserly individual who is transformed into a model of generosity and kindness. Dickens wrote during a time of horrific economic and social injustice in England, largely ruled by a multitude of Scrooges whose hearts were locked shut with greed and power. Ultimately, an inner Scrooge in any context is ruled by fear of scarcity, the terror of not enough. In childhood, in my fundamentalist Christian home, every thought, word, and deed in every moment was centered around religion and what my parents believed was there and my reason for being. Jesus, the Bible, Christian theology, and the literal return of Jesus, in which he would take all people who had accepted him as their personal savior to heaven to live forever in the Promised Land. In the Old Testament, the Promised Land was the land which was promised by God to Abraham and his descendants. Land that the Jewish people, sometimes wandering, sometimes in exile, would finally have as their own. However, both definitions of the Promised Land assume that it is external, something out there in the future, aspired to but not yet realized. The journey my second encounter with cancer evoked led me to another kind of Promised Land, one that was profoundly internal and that, like the spirits of Christmas past, present, and future, made Scrooge weep and laugh with joy. The inner promised land is not a state of being, not a domain or a destination. Rather, it is invariably dynamic and in motion, as opposed to a final dwelling place in which one graduates and rests on one's laurels. I experience the promised land as an evolutionary process comprised of junctures in our development in which we abide for a while and then move on. Rather than a linear process, the promised land appears to be more about deepening rather than progressing, more about familiarity with the territory of the heart than mastery of intellect. The promise is not made by a supreme being, but by life itself. We are promised that if we continually open to what is in front of us, if we surrender to the present moment rather than resisting it, we are likely to experience the fullness of what it means to be a human being, as well as the magnitude of the sacred essence that lies at our core.